Another record day for New South Wales with 390 new cases and tragically 2 more deaths.
One woman in her 40s in southwestern Sydney. There was also the tragic death of a man in his late 90s.
The state now has a worrying new battle on its hands with 25 new infections in the west overnight. The fates of remote Indigenous communities in the balance.
The ICU in a place like that is nowhere near what we would expect in Sydney. So that's why the entire New South Wales Health Service is on high alert.
And as other states continue to mop up their own Delta outbreaks, the New South Wales government is copping it.
I think we would need to hear very clearly from New South Wales what their clear plan is for containment. The last thing we want to see is this virus spread north, the virus spread south and spread across the nation.
New South Wales is actually going the opposite direction to what the National Cabinet has agreed.
I appreciate every Premier has a view.
WA is now taking things into its own hands, implementing the country's toughest border restrictions yet.
Those people who are exempted and allowed to come in, if they want to do so, they have to be tested prior to arrival with a negative test result. They have to at least have had one vaccine dose.
The state taking what's likely to be the first step towards national vaccine passports.
I think this is actually a template for other states, should they want to put in place measures to protect themselves from the raging outbreak in New South Wales.
I do welcome the requirement for vaccination. That's not unlike the sorts of things we've been talking about for some time.
National Cabinet today, no doubt an awkward affair, although the PM thought it was totally cool.
New South Wales Premier was able to respond to issues that were raised in the meeting today, and they were raised in a good spirit, and I think they were addressed in a good spirit.
Insider's host David Spears is here to give us the lowdown on what went on. David, you just heard there, addressed in good spirits. Is that code for we're still washing the blood off the walls?
Well, Waleed, collegiate was the Prime Minister's word. A separate source tells me it was actually a pretty boring meeting. It may have been one of these situations where they will talk a big game going into the talks once they're behind closed doors or on the virtual hookup. They all play nice. I also think Gladys Berejiklian has backed off some of the talk of easing off restrictions. I don't expect she's going to do much, given case numbers just continue to rise, continue to leak out of Sydney. You saw in that piece where cases are popping up across country New South Wales. You can see why other states are very concerned about this. The worse it gets, the greater the prospect of more cases leaking out of not just Sydney but New South Wales. So I really don't think, if she was pressed much today in that National Cabinet meeting, I don't think Gladys Berejiklian would have given too many signs that she's suddenly going to ease restrictions much, if at all, really.
WA already requires vigorous testing and quarantine. So is bringing in a vaccine requirement now more political than practical?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Look, WA has always, since this pandemic began, taken the hardest line on border closures and restrictions. And look, there's a fair chunk of Western Australia that would like to make that permanent. Thank you very much. Look, this addition of a vaccine requirement, some proof that you've had a jab, it's the first jurisdiction to do that in Australia. Now, it was interesting today, the Prime Minister backed that move from Mark McGowan from Western Australia, but only for now. Once we are all vaccinated, or at least we've hit that 80% threshold of vaccination, Scott Morrison's point is we won't need those sort of things, and he really would be in trouble. He wouldn't be able to support them at that point, because a lot of the Liberal Party base hate the idea of requiring any Australians to show a certificate to cross the state border.
David, Gladys Berejiklian was the PM's faithful upholder of the gold standard last year. Now they seem to contradict each other on a daily basis. Has she lost his support over the handling of this outbreak?
Yeah, a lot of the shine has gone out of that relationship, Lisa. It's very clear. In fact, it's clear there's a lot of tension between the federal government and the New South Wales government over what's happening and some of the missteps in all of this. I've had federal sources tell me they do want New South Wales to take further steps, whether it's a statewide lockdown, whether it's tighter restrictions in Sydney. I've had New South Wales government sources say to me they're very angry at the federal government over vaccine supply and still some issues in regards to the information they're getting there. So, yeah, it's a long way from where they were last year. A lot of love in the air, gold standard. This is the model state when it comes to the pandemic. Now it is a very different situation.
David, the PM says Australia is now achieving world-class marks on vaccination. Do you think he'll be able to shake off all the bungles in the long term?
Look, maybe anything's possible in politics, and the election could still be, most likely, not until May next year. So, look, if everything goes swimmingly from here. We're all vaccinated by the end of the year. The sun's shining. We all catch up with family at Christmas. The economy's rebounding. And look, it's possible that the Prime Minister can recover politically by then. But everything needs to go right. And I think we still don't know what the scars are going to be from a prolonged lockdown in Sydney that could still run for at least another couple of months. What structural damage is going to be done to the economy? What sort of stress and strain on families is going to be permanent? What anger is going to attach permanently to Scott Morrison? Will he be marked down for not managing this well, for lacking empathy as well? How much is that is going to be permanent damage? We really don't know yet.
Yeah, the scars are the real issue there. We just saw in the overlay we were rolling there at I think it was a vaccination site, there was an ad for Delta Goodrem. Do you think that's insensitive in the current circumstances?
What, Delta?
It's terrible. So is that joke, Waleed. That's terrible.
Well, yeah, it wasn't a joke. That's what they did. I mean, Delta's great, but in the circumstances. Anyway, clearly I'm the only person who thinks about that. Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight.
Guys.
From expert opinions to in-depth analysis and reporting, the Project YouTube brings you the biggest stories from Australia and around the globe. Hit the subscribe button now for news delivered straight to your feed.